Okay, so I wonder where we plug the scanner in on this thing, 1941 Chevy. Actually, it does have a diagnostic port because it's got the drivetrain out of a 90s throttle body Chevy 305 or 5 liter. Wiring from the alternator down to the starter burnt because the customer accidentally hooked the battery cables up backwards, and when somebody wired this thing, they never put a fusible link in that wire at the starter like it would typically have. In the 90s, when this engine came out of a car, the distance between the starter and the battery was only a couple of feet, so the factory never ran a fusible link wire. But the customer has this battery located in the trunk, so they ran the power feed from the alternator down to the starter and never installed a fusible link wire at the starter. So when the battery cable was hooked up backwards, the alternator became a dead short through the rectifier bridge and melted the wiring. So we're going to have to pull the wiring harness out of it and basically rebuild it, because obviously you can't buy a replacement harness. So working on this 41, and the wiring harness from the alternator, which runs behind the engine, down over top of the bell housing and all the way back over to the starter, is all melted and burnt because of a battery polarity issue. So I'm trying to pull this harness out of here, but it's not cooperating because it's all melted into the other harnesses. There's several harnesses running down here, but well, we'll work on it and keep going. Okay, so I moved the wiring for the control side of the alternator and the O2 sensor, which is down here on the manifold, and rewired it and spliced in some new wire and ran a new loom. I'm going to run this one down inside the valve cover here. It's nice and neat, and I just have to tape up the harness at the back now. I'm going to run a new output wire, a little heavier, and then run a fuse link on the wire 2 sizes smaller at the starter to protect it so this doesn't happen again. Okay, so here's what the original owner or original builder of this vehicle had done. They had run the alternator output wire directly to the positive battery cable, using it as a feed stud, which is similar to what was done in the 70s and 80s, but there should have been a fusible link on it, so this is the wire I cut off. Now I noticed there's another wire coming off that feeds a bunch of wires going into the vehicle, probably to the ignition switch, and there was one other red wire which was not fused either. It is now going to have a fusible link in it. I'll put a separate terminal. So I installed a fusible link in it, and I'm going to run a separate output wire from the alternator directly to the battery post on the starter, and I'll put a fusible link 2 gauge sizes smaller at the starter. You can see that there are some fusible links here, but they were actually taped in the harness, and they shouldn't be. They should be left out of the harness in case one was to burn, so it doesn't start the tape on fire and potentially escalate into a thermal event. So it's back together and running. Charging 14.07, 14.08, and it was actually about 14.5 at the back of the alternator. So given all the extra wire involved to get to the battery back here, it's normal to have a little bit of loss like that, but it is charging.